Zoom thing, getting off the last meeting. And then I had signed up for this, and then I went to Zoom and I had no meeting scheduled and my system froze, so I had to get on and come back off. I guess it's just my Zoom doing something weird.
Zoom acting up sometimes.
Yep. They do. They do.
So we're starting to get some more participants in. We'll give it a few minutes so we can get a couple more in.
You guys missed a wonderful talk that ended with a workshop where we drew monarch butterflies. Mine is a swallowtail because I can't draw butterflies, even though our very talented leader who founded the Monarch Project to talk about humanizing immigration drew one upside down in front of us. She drew this incredible, she painted it in like 20 minutes of workshop. I can't believe that. So, but she had us all, she said, if you have paint laying around, I'm like, no, I don't have paint laying around, but I stole my son's colored crayons and a piece of construction paper. So.
Alrighty, so I think I will just go ahead and start off with welcoming you guys back to Social Justice Week for those of you guys who have joined us before, and welcome to everyone who is just joining us for the first time. So as we've all heard, our SSU student Shelby Wade was actually the one who created Sonoma State's Social Justice Week, and we've been doing it ever since 2015. The goal here is just to provide a space for not only the Sonoma State student body, but the community as well, to contribute ideas, gain perspective, and get an understanding of current social justice. Our mission is to connect students with advocates who help students develop theoretical understanding of whose land SSU sits upon and the power of grassroots activism for better human betterment and social change, while raising student and community awareness of engagement with issues embedded in societal structures of inequality. So I'm Danielle Caballero. Some of you guys joined my other session as well. I will be your guys' host for today. If we have any questions for our speaker today, you guys can shoot them in the chat, raise your hand, unmute. If you guys have any questions or concerns, you guys can feel free to send me a chat or send Tanya a chat, who will be facilitating our session today. So this is Tanya Arango Rodriguez. She is, as I said, going to be facilitating our session. She's been a great student helper for this Social Justice Week, and it's one of the big parts of making this happen. So I'm very grateful to have her and have her helping with facilitation. And today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Bristol with us. Travis J. Bristol is an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. His scholarship is situated at the intersection of educational policy and teacher education. Dr. Bristol explores three related research strands, which is the first, the role of educational policies in shaping the workplace experiences and retention of teachers of color. The second, district and school-based professional learning communities for educators of color. The third, the role of race and gender in educational settings. His research has appeared in peer-reviewed journals as the American Educational Research Journal, the Journal of Teacher Education, Urban Education, Teachers College Record, and the Harvard Educational Review. His national awards include both dissertation and postdoctoral fellowships from the National Academy of Education, Spencer Foundation from 2013 and 2020, and the National Academies of Science, Ford Foundation 2013 and 2019. The inaugural Teacher Diversity Research Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education 2016, and Early Career Awards from the American Educational Research Association Division K 2021, and the Comparative International Education Society African Diaspora SIG 2019. Dr. Bristol received his AB from Amherst College and an MA from the Stanford University and a PhD from Teachers College, Columbia University. So I'll now be going over our ground rules, and our student facilitator will be placing them into the Zoom chat for anyone who will be joining us a little bit later today. So for questions and discussion, the first part of the session will be a presentation, and you will have a chance to interact with our speaker during the second part. As of our continuing commitment to social justice work, when we have experienced examples of oppression, we will speak up. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention. We will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in service of ending oppression. For technology, For questions, if anyone has any questions on how to use the Zoom interface, you can use the chat function, send a direct message to our facilitator, who once again is Tanya, or myself. For microphones, so microphones will remain unmuted during our session. If you guys want to ask our speaker any questions while his presentation is going on, you guys can either use the chat function or wait until we do the Q&A afterwards. For cameras, you guys are welcome to keep your cameras on. If you do keep your cameras on, just be mindful of the background distractions, and no inappropriate displays or gestures through the camera will, if you do so, that will result in an instant removal from the session. For behavior, just remember to step up and step back. If you speak often, don't speak as much. And if you don't speak as much, speak more. We need to be courteous to others and avoid inflammatory language. Speak from your own perspective. Remember to always criticize ideas and not the individuals. And we will not tolerate any derogatory nor hateful languages or actions. Avoid speaking over each other, and please respect people's contributions. As stated before, the consequences of violating the ground rules will be one written warning, and then if they persist, we will have to remove you from today's session. So for the purposes of the session, today we will be doing a forum with Dr. Bristol. The first 30 minutes will be him going over his work and how he's engaged in social justice, and then we will do a Q&A afterwards. And with all that being said, I'd like to turn the attention over to Dr. Bristol for his presentation today.
Thank you, Danielle, for that introduction. Remind me next time to give you the shorter version, but thank you nonetheless. It's good to be here. I see some familiar faces, and we at UC Berkeley have sent two new professors your way, Teresa Stone and Patrick Johnson. So those are our UC Berkeley alums who are at Sonoma and have had really good things to say about the place and the space. So my talk today will be really trying and just, can you see the entire screen, or is it, let's see here. Is that okay? Is to really talk about how we might imagine schools to support Black boys and Black male teachers. And what I'll do is really talk about the connection in some ways between the school-based experiences of Black boys and the work I've done to support novice teachers to think about how to support Black boys, and the work I've done in school districts to help school systems think about how you support Black male teachers, and in particular, and more generally, male teachers of color. I think I should have also mentioned in that introduction is that I spent 5 years as a classroom teacher in New York City, and then 3 years as a teacher educator in the Boston Teacher Residency Program. And both at Berkeley and before Berkeley, I was at Boston University. I trained teachers, and so I see myself as a teacher first. And so all teachers have outlines, and so with this outline, I just will sort of organize my talk today. First, I'll talk a bit about my experience teaching in New York City public schools. I'll talk a bit about outcomes for boys of color, my experience as a clinical teacher educator supporting boys of color, outcomes for male teachers of color, and my experience again supporting as a clinical teacher educator supporting male teachers of color. I began teaching in New York City in 2004. And in my third year teaching in New York City, I started to notice a particular pattern. I saw that on average, every time I'd go to the principal's office, I'd see boys of color waiting for a pre-suspension hearing or detention hearing. And so I started this after school program, in many ways trying to support these boys of color, and in some ways trying to fix, if you will, these boys of color. I thought that if I could just help them and support them, then they would do better in school, that they would, it would decrease the likelihood that they would go see the principal. So this after school program that I started, you see the young men there, the MI to the left with kind of a little bit more here. And we got to see men of color across the city. On this visit, the late David Dinkins, New York City's only Black mayor, came and spent time with the students. As you saw, there were some very neoliberal politics in the work. It made all the young men wear a tie. because again, it was something with them, and they needed to be and look in particular ways. Um, uh, and one of the things that happened was that while many of these young men did better in some ways in my own class, and I saw them become more engaged in my own class, the same problems that I was trying to correct outside of my class, their suspension, their detention, in the school did not decrease. So yes, it worked in my class, but the problem, right, the unit of change, trying to get these young men to do better in school, those problems persisted. And in many ways, the issues and the experiences of these boys of color were similar to the experiences of boys of color across the United States. So these data from the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights looks at out-of-school suspension. And I want to say that race matters, right? So if you look at this bar graph, you see that Black girls on average are more likely to be suspended, 12 times as likely, right, to be suspended when compared to Asian girls. But when we account for gender, we see that boys, in particular Black boys, and boys across all of these subgroups have higher suspension rates. So yes, race matters. And when we look at that intersection, right, we see that 20% of Black boys receive out of school suspensions in the United States during this data collection period compared to 1% of Asian girls. So gender matters, race and gender matters. And these data hold when we look at how students, their sort of graduation rates. Here, Latinx young women are less likely to graduate than when compared to other young women, Black young women, white young women, Asian young women. So yes, right, in terms of ethno-racial identity matters, in terms of graduation rates. But when we account for gender, we see that across each of these subgroups, that it is boys on average, or young men rather on average, who are less likely to graduate than everyone else. Now, fast forward, when I began working with the Boston Teacher Residency Program, training teachers, I encountered a novice teacher. Her name was Kelsey. And Kelsey said to me that the boys in her class were disengaged, that the boys in her class won't stop talking about video games. And so I thought to myself, well, I could, what I did was I started this after school program, but I recognized that Kelsey, as a novice teacher, and not even a novice teacher, as a pre-service teacher, Kelsey did not have the capacity to design an after school program like I had designed in my third year. And then as I thought more about that after school program, right, that I had designed, I also recognized that the theory of action was flawed, because in some ways I was trying to fix these young men, and these young men, they weren't broken, right? It was really the system that was broken. It was that my colleagues and the administration didn't have the tools, the resources, the experiences to support these young men. So it wasn't an issue with the young men, it was with developing the capacity of the adults in the building to support the students in the building. And so when I worked with Kelsey, I said, well, Kelsey, what are you doing in your class? The boys are disengaged. Kelsey was an ELA pre-service teacher, English language arts. And so I said, what are you doing in your class? What content are you teaching? Might there be some way to connect the interests that these boys are having, these middle school boys are having, and incorporate it into the content? So Kelsey at the time was teaching a unit on characterization, and so she and I worked on developing multiple end of unit assignments, and one of which the students had an option to design a video game, and they could talk about how a character develops over time in a video game. And so I spent some time talking to these young men in Kelsey's class. I'll play this video, and I asked them to talk about what was it like to have your teacher show care and concern for your own interests. And this is what these middle school young men said. Were you surprised when Ms. McShane said that you could do a project on a video game?
Yes. Yeah.
Why were you surprised by that?
Because we talk about video games all the time, we get sick of it.
Yeah.
And you and sorry, I say that we talk about video, and who gets sick of it?
The teachers, the girls.
The girls.
Because they don't want to hear it. They say, "Oh, we do it every day, every second of our life," but we don't do that.
And so Izzy, why were you surprised when Ms. McShane said that you could talk about video games for your final project?
Because I remember our teacher, Miss Roberts, our humanity teacher, she told us that she was going to start taking away points if we kept talking about video games.
Wow, so she was going to take away points, but Ms. McShane actually said what? She said
stop talking about them.
But then she allowed us to do the project.
Like when we had to do, she allowed us to do something about video games because we like it so much, but it had to do with like work.
Okay. And when she told you that you could like do a final project on video games, how did that make you feel about the work that you were required to do?
I feel like now that like we have something that like we're interested in, because all three of us and a couple other kids from our class, like we all have like we play online, like Xbox.
Oh, you do?
So we can actually like take the experiences from that we had from Xbox and like online. So all the games we play, we just put it into our project.
And so what these students said was that in their previous classes, one of the teachers punished them, saw their interest as one that required punishment. But this teacher, Ms. McShane, listened to them, and they said, I think you heard Izzy say, the student to the right, that it felt how joy-filled he felt, how meaningful his work felt when his interests that he had outside of the class were brought into the class. I should say that each of these three students have an IEP, an individualized education plan. I should also say that all children in America deserve an individualized education plan, but we only reserve that for Black and Brown children, or privileged white children when it's time to take the SATs. But that's a different talk for another day. So here you hear these students say that in many ways that their teacher honored the video game and brought it into their. And then I loop back with their teacher, Kelsey, and I asked her, what did she think about, what did she learn? What were some of her observations, right, about having students, by designing this content and having students sort of be engaged. This is what she said.
Always talking about video games, here's a way that you can incorporate that into our final project, like into the content goals. And also seeing, like, I think with these boys especially, they saw themselves as not only experts, but as writers. And it was so interesting to see themselves as like really proud of the writing that they were doing, you know, like showing it to each other, critiquing each other, like, oh no, you can't do that, like working with each other about it, and just seeing themselves as like real writers.
And so for this teacher, she, by redesigning her content, created the conditions whereby her students could see themselves in the content. Instead of punishing, she sought to engage. Instead of taking a magnifying glass to say, what's wrong with you? Let me examine you. She took a mirror and said, what was wrong with me and my practice that has to be reimagined to create the conditions whereby the students in my classroom can learn. And too often in our schools, part of this, I believe, is because of the ethno-racial and the gender composition of the teacher workforce. But too often in our schools, we choose to punish boys, and in particular, Black and Latinx boys. And that's why we see the outcomes that we see. Sometimes we move to create mentoring programs, and mentoring programs are really key. My Brother's Keeper, those programs are really key. But the unit of change has to be with supporting teachers to create the conditions in their classroom so that all of the children in our country can see themselves as writers and not believe that this interest that they have, that it lies outside of the classroom. I've written a bit about this in this article, a quick Google search. I'm happy to send it to Danielle, where I talk about Kelsey. I give her a pseudonym, what I call around this idea of teaching boys, right, toward a theory of gender relevant pedagogy. And what I would, the experiences of Black boys in schools are in many ways similar to the experiences, I would say, on Black male teachers, in that they are pushed out of schools in some of the same ways that Black boys are. For example, these data come from the School and Staffing Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of teachers. If you look at the brown bar, right, you'll see that minority teachers or teachers of color have higher rates of turnover than white teachers, those teachers who are in the black bar. And when a closer analysis, we find that in particular, it is Black teachers who have a higher rate of turnover than Latinx and white teachers. This study was done by the Albert Shanker Institute, which is a research arm of the American Federation of Teachers. And even closer analysis, right, we find that it is Black male teachers, right, who have higher turnover rates. So like Black boys, Black male teachers are pushed out or exit schools at a higher rate than the rest of their peers. To try to understand why Black male teachers were leaving at a higher rate, I did a study of Black male teachers in Boston public schools. Boston, it is when I moved there, I thought I was moving to a northeastern liberal city. Little did I know that in 1974, Boston schools, then and now, right, were desegregated. There was actually de jure segregation, so legal in some way segregation, that the federal courts under Judge Arthur Garrity rendered this decision to to integrate Boston public schools. And so I studied the experiences of Black male teachers in Boston public schools, and here are these sort of two findings, right, that I observed. The first finding was that the Black male teachers in my study believed that their colleagues saw them as intellectually inferior. Dennis Sangister, when I asked him what was it like to be a teacher at a school, he said, "It sucks, and if I could swear, I would." And so when I asked him, "Tell me why it sucks," he talked about how when he would attend faculty meetings, he would talk to his colleagues, most of whom were white, about how to move away from harsh disciplinary practices, how to move to more restorative justice practices, how to use culture sustaining pedagogy to decenter whiteness. And his colleagues would dismiss his ideas. Sangister said, "They don't respect my professional opinion. Is it because I'm Black? Even now, it still bugs me if I'm saying it. Are you not hearing me? It really messes with me sometimes. I mean, it makes you feel inadequate. Like, am I saying something that's crazy? I've been educated. I have a master's. I've passed the licensure exam. Just like everyone else, it's frustrating, you know." The Black men in my study, many of them believed that their colleagues saw them as intellectually inferior. And then the second finding was that many of these Black men believed that their colleagues saw them as a behavior manager first and not a teacher second, if at all. And this meant that their colleagues, the Black men said that their colleagues would always bring the misbehaving students to them for them to watch while they were teaching, while they were eating lunch, because they were the police officers in the school, not the teachers. Jermaine Carter says, "You know, I can see that most people would feel enthused that they're helping out their colleagues, that they picked me because they respect me. But it's also becoming a burden now because I have other things to do. I have to plan for my kids to be on a specific track, plan my scope and sequence, correct papers, just the regular things that teachers do." But Jermaine Carter, like many of his colleagues, could not do the regular things that teachers could do because he had to be the school police officer, the school safety agent, while he was teaching, while he was eating, while he was grading papers, because that's how his colleagues saw him. And that frustration on the part of many of these Black men made them think and wonder if this was the right profession for them. I've written a bit about this in a piece. But some of the implications for this work have been in some ways to start what I've termed an affinity group in Boston many years ago to support male teachers of color. So in this video, you'll hear this participant talk about the work that he has done to support boys of color. One of the fascinating things about this affinity group that I created, an affinity group is essentially, it was a group of men of color. We met once a month on Fridays from 5 to 7, and people in the group came and brought their own dilemmas in their classroom, but they could then get some feedback from other people in the affinity group. At the end of each meeting, someone would share a dilemma, and then we would take it up during the next month's meeting. So in this February meeting, people wanted to talk about what was the role of male teachers of color in educating boys of color. And one of the things that these men said, lo and behold, was that people think that just because you are a man of color, that automatically you know what to do to support boys of color. And there's nothing in our teacher preparation programs that are helping us do this. And I remember, I say, when I started teaching in New York City, on day one, I felt prepared. I felt like I received high quality teacher prep. It was a year-long program. I spent all that entire year in a classroom and then taking coursework. But there was nothing in that program that helped me understand why in New York, they still call it Columbus Day here in California, rightly so, we call it Indigenous Peoples Day. When we came back to school on that Tuesday, I didn't understand why all of a sudden I had all these boys of color in my classroom. What was I supposed to do? What should I do differently? But there was nothing in my program that prepared me for this experience. And these men said there was nothing in their programs that prepared them for this. And yet, when they arrived at their schools, their colleagues expected them to support boys of color. And so here in the safe space, they could ask each other, what should we do? What are you doing? And here in a second, you'll hear this, one of the facilitators of the program, Greg, will talk about he uses math swag in his classroom to support boys. Swag, as some of you may know, it's not the thing that you get from a conference. It's ARA season, those of you who are in academia, and all that ARA stuff that we get, it's not that stuff. Swag in an urban context, now we're just cool, confident. And so he uses this idea of swag, math swag, and he uses it as an acronym, students who achieve great gains. And that's what he uses as his class as a motivator for engaging the boys of color in his class.
Align with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But in students' context, it's something different.
So this idea of taking what we might call students' funds of knowledge, you saw it in the previous clip that I showed with Kelsey, taking what students know outside of classroom, their experiences, right, their knowledge base outside of the classroom, and bringing that into the classroom, right? That's not a revolutionary idea. That's not something that is new, right? But here in this context, you have a group of men who are perceived at their school site, right, as not being content expertise, not knowing their curriculum, not caring about their curriculum because they're behavior managers, but they're deeply desiring to have some ideas around how to support, how to teach. And so in this safe space, they're able to share what they are doing, be viewed as practitioners, and then maybe take up some of those ideas in their own classroom. I'll sort of end by saying that, that we have seen really a proliferation over the past couple of years of these types of affinity group programs where both districts and community-based organizations, if you will, are organizing professional development, ongoing professional learning for men of color and teachers of color in particular, who attend to the experiences that they have in their schools that make it challenging for them to teach. And so the takeaway here is that in some ways, that in many ways, the experiences of Black boys in schools and Black young men in schools mirror the outcomes for Black male teachers. And there are some things that we can do to address and to stem some of the outcomes that we see for in K-12 schools for boys. It's really greater professional learning for all teachers to help them understand the gendered ways that they teach their content, and to think about how they might incorporate some of the socialized, gendered experiences of the children or the boys took in their classroom, engage those boys, and for Black teachers, and Black male teachers in particular, right, thinking about the kinds of professional learning that we need to create for these teachers, and then take some of that professional learning, how these Black men are experiencing, the ways in which they are talking about what they need in their professional, what they're talking about in their professional learning, and feeding that back to administrators so that administrators are aware of some of the challenging conditions that they are creating or that other teachers are creating for these Black teachers. So with that, I will stop sharing and am happy to answer questions and engage in conversation. I think I have used, gone up to my 30 minutes, so I think I've done what I've been tasked to do. And I see Joe smiling, so I think he approves of me doing what I've been tasked to do.
Yeah, you did a really great job. Thank you for your presentation. So now we're going to start the Q&A section. If you guys have any questions, you guys can drop them in the chat. If you want to keep them anonymous, we can go ahead and send them to either myself or Tanya, and we can ask them for you. If you want to use your voice to ask the question, you guys can feel free to unmute, just keeping the ground rules in mind, please.
I do have a question, a couple of questions actually from Joe. His question is, Black male educators make up only 1% of public school teachers throughout our US education system. Can you explain both the seen and unseen factors that funnel Black male teachers out of the education system? And how can educators support the retention of Black teachers within our communities?
Yeah, thank you. That's something I've been thinking a bit about. So just so you know, the last numbers that we've seen, it's 1.7%. It was actually 1.9%, I think in 2000. Obama comes elected 2008. 2008, it was I think 1.9%. When Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan launches the Black male teacher recruitment campaign, calling Black men to the Blackboard. The most recent data that come from the teacher and principal survey, and I can send that to you, it's 1.7%. So we are seeing a small decline, but a decline nonetheless, given all of these efforts around the country to get more people who look like me into the profession. So the first place to start, a couple of years ago, I gave a talk at the Massachusetts District Attorney's Office. This was the same guy who was responsible for all the celebrities who were cheating. You may have heard of the scandal, I forget the something blue scandal. But this guy, he was appointed by President Trump, but nonetheless was interested in thinking about issues of diversity. I think that's why we saw that him go after those folks. And so he said to me, well, how can we get more Black teachers? And I said, the first thing that what you and your office could do is to actually hold districts accountable that suspend a disproportionate number of Black children. You can't get people into the profession if you suspend them in K-12 schools. So that is the first place. I often tell the very painful story. I didn't know that preschool suspension was a thing until one day I had to go pick up my son from his preschool and was told by the executive director that he needed to take a break from school. I didn't know that was a thing. My wife and I are both in the faculty at UC Berkeley, and he's doing quite well, going to, we'll be going to an overpriced high school. Um, um, but not all Black children and Black boys, right, have parents who have terminal degrees who end up at professors at UC Berkeley who can tend, right, and to put a buffer around them. So the first thing is we got to stop suspending Black and brown children, Black boys in particular. The second is I think that we need to actually do some work around actually talking about the benefits of teaching. I think teaching, when people ask me if I've ever left, how do I feel about leaving the classroom? I say, I've never left the classroom. I just have a bigger classroom, but I think we need to talk about the benefits, right? And the joy that people have, that Black men have in teaching, and show that people like me are teachers, right? And so when I was at the Stanford Teacher Education Program, on average, many of the images, when we watched images of practice, right? I never saw a Black male teacher as a person whose practice I should emulate. And so if I don't see me as being a practitioner or being deemed as someone who is an expert practitioner, right? How do you bring more folks in? So I think that's one thing. I think we also have to bring down the cost of becoming a teacher. There's a bill, I've been working with Superintendent Tony Thurman and his office. There's a bill that was currently passed. The bill came out of committee actually yesterday. I think it's AB 520 or 540. It's called like the California Educator Diversity Bill or something. It has that name, where the state, there's going to be, some resources to bring down the cost of becoming a teacher. So I think that's important. That, and I can go on and on. I think that teacher prep programs need to do a better job of supporting teachers to pass the California State Teacher Certification Exam. So the tests may not go away. I tell people Danielle read my bio. And so I've gone to pretty elite schools, and I'm a tenure track professor. I am the Superintendent Thurman. I'm chairing his diversity council, and Travis Bristol, when I was at Stanford, failed the CSET too many times to count. And one of the things that Stanford did, Linda Donning-Hammond was the director of the program. Linda sat me down in her office, and Linda said, "We're going to get you a tutor," and I got a tutor, right? The test wasn't going to go away, but my program took it upon itself, and Linda took it upon herself to get me a tutor, and eventually I passed the exam. So I think that needs to happen. I feel like there are other questions. I mean, but I think, I've been thinking about this for a while, and then when folks get into the classroom, we can't just place all Black teachers in the most challenging schools. One of the reasons why there's large numbers of turnover is because there's this belief that just because you look like me, then you can go into the most challenging school without the most challenging resources. My faith tradition tells me that you can't make bricks without straw. You can't do the impossible if you don't have skills, if you don't have resources. So you can't give me an overcrowded classroom and expect me to attend to students' social and emotional trauma, get me a guidance counselor, reduce class size, right? So those are among the many things that can be done to increase the number of Black male teachers. Thank you for the question, Jim.
And I actually had a question as well. So earlier in your presentation, you were talking about how teachers should be going from a punishment kind of perspective within the classrooms to a more like restorative way of teaching and mentoring. What kind of advice would you give to teachers in order to start implementing that within their classrooms?
So I would say that first, if you don't know how to do it, then you should And if you weren't trained how to do it in your teacher prep program, then you should turn to your principal and let the instructional leader in your building find someone in the district to give you the support that you need. So I think that is the first, right? It's the job of the instructional leader to support you. And so if you can't do it, right, you need to ask for some help. And then I would say, I mean, there's just a whole, the Abolish Teaching Network, which is run by Bettina Love. I think that some of their content is free that you might be able to like look at online. I think that, sorry. Um, uh, I mean, I think there's just a whole list of online resources. Django Paris has termed the coin, DJANGO. Paris has termed the coin, coined the term culturally sustaining pedagogy. And so I know that he has lots of resources around. So I think like online search, right, might help, I think, in some ways.
I have another question from Joe. He says, how should educators go about practicing and preparing an environment where its Black and Brown students are allowed to be themselves in the classroom, entirely both inside and outside of the classroom?
So I think it's important, one, to first recognize and hold that Black people are not a monolithic group of people, that Black people are different. Sorry, it's almost comical I have to say that. But I'm saying it and saying how outlandish that sounds. But I think it's important because I think that lots of people, right, think that all Black people are the same. Or all Black children have the same sort of experiences. And so I think that it's important to understand, one, the diversity in students. And so, very practical tools could be, first day inventories of students, asking students to share their likes, their dislikes, for example. The second thing I think is also important to do is to spend time, if you are not from the community where your students are from, in the community where your students are from. So when I began teaching in New York City, I lived in New York City my whole life. I'm a New Yorker. I live out here on the left coast, and I'm a New Yorker. But New York City is a very segregated city. I lived in Brooklyn. Many of the students that I taught lived in, some of the students that I taught lived in Washington Heights. If you know New York City, it's Upper Manhattan. It would probably take about 2 hours by train to get from where I lived in Brooklyn all the way to Washington Heights. And many of those students were Dominican. I never spent any time in Washington Heights because there was no reason for me to go there, if you will, as a high schooler. And when I realized as an English teacher that some of my particularly students who were Dominican from Washington Heights, who were Dominican ancestry, right? First generation Dominican or Dominican themselves, their language acquisition. When I went up to Washington Heights for the first time, I was struck that lots of signs were in Spanish and people were speaking in Spanish. Because in Brooklyn, I don't know of any, I'm trying to think, maybe Spanish Harlem once upon a time, but in New York City, there are very few places that you walk around and you see signs in Spanish. And so as an adult, I was blown away. I was like, this begins to provide some context. It did not lower my expectations for my students, but it provided some context to how students were engaging in my course and some of their lived experience. And so I think it's so helpful and so necessary for all teachers. There's a video of me talking, a quick Google search can find it, some project I did with XQ, where when I was a classroom teacher, I would take my colleagues, it was called Welcome to Our World. I would take my colleagues on a tour of the neighborhoods of our students. And many of the white teachers, right, because they may have felt unsafe and had no reason, and because white people weren't, they just wouldn't want to walk around, but how helpful it was for them to go and to visit and just to see the communities in which their students live. So I think, yeah, I think it's necessary to that question is to actually spend some time in the places and spaces of our students.
Has a question? Hi, Travis. My name is Reggie Vermani. I'm a teacher educator at Sonoma State, and I've heard you speak numerous times. And we actually run a male educators of color group at Sonoma State, which a lot of the things that you've brought up around feeling isolated in the classroom and just it's been very true with the experiences that we have of our educators in the area. One thing I was wondering about is one time I heard you say this in another talk, and I wanted to ask you to expand on it a little bit. You mentioned that teachers of color, especially Black teachers, teaching are good for teaching Black children, students of color, but also good for white students and students who are, not of color. And could you talk a little bit more about that? That always stuck with me, and I just wanted to always ask you that question, a follow-up question. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, good to see you. I know you participate in like the lab, the collaborative, right?
Yeah.
No, I remember faces. It's the teacher in me. So at Cal, I mean, just even being here is my current position. Particularly when we were in person, I mean, without fail, at the end of the first class, but this is now my third year, so I've taught the class twice. Students would come up, Latinx students, Black students, white students not so much. When I was at Boston University, but students, I distinctly remember this experience at Cal. Like some Latinx students would come up to me, and they would say, I just want you to know that that you are the first Black teacher that I've had, right? And that's just sort of, somewhat mind-blowing, but it is a reality. I think to the question about white students in particular, I often give, you may have heard me talk about this, right? That, when I think about during President Obama's State of the Union address, the first State of the Union, and a lawmaker yelled, "You lie," breaking all sorts of norms, right, around interrupting the commander-in-chief of the State of the Union. In many ways, why that congressperson, I think, yelled, "You lie," was because it created such a great deal of cognitive dissonance for that white man to have not the person who was guarding the mall where his maybe kids had gone to school, or picking up the garbage, right, in his neighborhood, that this person was not their inferior, if you will, but their superior. And that creates a great deal of cognitive dissonance. And the way that I've experienced it is, in teaching, right, particularly at the graduate level, a bit more so when I was at Boston University, where white students it took them some time to wrap their heads around the idea that I could teach them, which meant that I was smarter than them, because that's just not how I show up in how they have been socialized and how most people in this country have been socialized. I think it's true even for when I was teaching in New York City and for my Black students, right? I mean, I remember some of my Black, particularly my Black male students, yeah, it took some time for them to get adjusted to the fact that that I did not meet some of the ways that Black men had shown up in their lives, maybe, and also through the media. So I think for all children, it is a very disruptive idea for people like me to be their intellectual inferior. And I think in particular for white children. And so when I say that we need more Black teachers, we need more Black teachers in Palo Alto. We need more Black teachers in Berkeley. We need Black teachers not only for Black children, because white children cannot continue to grow up living in a country where they believe that they are the center and that all intellect and all things reside in them. It is dangerous for white children to grow up living this lie, white people this lie. And the way that we can disrupt that is by having more people who look like me become their teacher. I hope that answers your question.
That was great. Thank you so much.
And then I also had another question in regards to your presentation. You were talking about how you created an after-school program. You thought that, correct me if I'm wrong, Kelsey wasn't able to kind of make a good after-school program. What would you say is kind of the importance of having good after-school programs for youth, especially youth of color?
So after-school programs are important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when I was in high school, I had a mentor. Programs like My Brother Keeper are important as untenured faculty, soon to be tenured faculty, right? Naming that. The soon to be tenured faculty, having mentors at UC Berkeley is incredibly important. I need people who have been in the way to show me the way, right? But just by having a mentor, it will not change the culture of the institution. So, my first year at UC Berkeley, there's a program called the Fiat Lux program, a program where high schoolers around 12 different urban centers or schools that have large influence of color can come. And I serve as a mentor. We were at the chancellor's house for this reception for the fellowship program. An older white gentleman, a faculty member at UC Berkeley, comes up to me and he says, well, what high school did you attend? That moment. So this was last year in the fall, right before things shut down. And so at that point, I realized, oh, he thinks I'm a high schooler. He doesn't, right? And and so I said, oh, I went to high school in New York City. I'm just playing along at this point. And then at some point, I tell him that actually I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley. And his mouth was maybe about a good 3 seconds, his mouth was open because he was in shock that I was not the person that he was engaging in this sort of benevolent program, right, to help, that I was his peer, I was his colleague. And so having a mentor that I could talk to is helpful and important. But a mentor is not going to change the culture of the institution. It's not going to help white faculty maybe take a step back and not assume that people who might be that we actually do have some Black faculty members, small they may be at the university. So mentoring programs are important, but mentoring programs don't, if we think about the mentoring program without also thinking about changing the culture of an institution, we're not going to create better outcomes for children because mentoring programs don't get at the root, right, of the problem. They're really a Band-Aid to the problem. Good and necessary, but they don't get at the root.
I think I could hear you talk forever, so I don't hesitant to interrupt, but I want to ask a question about what do we do when we work with teams of faculty, predominantly white faculty, that are really different places and how they think about whether it's culturally relevant pedagogy or, and I would say that there's a sense of like everyone like, yeah. But then it just, I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. I think that all people need images of good practice. Right? So Magna Lampert, many years ago, created this work. One of the reasons why I have all these videos is because something I learned from Magna Lampert when I was working at BTR. Magna Lampert was someone who, as you may know, that she wrote about the idea that you can't just sort of like teach novice teachers good practice. You actually have to capture it in real time so that people can see it. So lots of these videos I have are really about giving people, so you all can actually see the students talking about Kelsey and some of these young, the male teachers talking about, right? You can actually see what the program looks like by being recorded. I think that white, in this case, if you will, white teachers need to see culturally sustaining pedagogy in action, culturally sustaining, and they need to see and hear students talk about why it worked. So you didn't see Kelsey teaching her content, but you could see the effect of what she did. And I think that it becomes hard in the face of both seeing teachers enact this practice and the result, which is the result is, student learning. If students are saying, and they're telling you, this has actually made me engage, made me learn, it becomes hard to, I think, challenge that. So I think we need more, I think people need images of what this practice, how it looks, and we need to videos of students saying, this is why this worked. We can't, preaching is good, I come from a preaching tradition. We can't, preaching is helpful, but at some point, right, folks want to see, we just passed Easter, right? Folks want to see that the grave is empty, right? People need to see stuff, right?
Hi, I wanted to follow up a little bit on Alita's question because I think it was such a good question. And um, just to follow up on something you said earlier, Dr. Bristol, and one of the things is that, of course, we should all be aware as people and as educators, especially, that, no group is a monolith. And then, as the leader brought up, teaching in a culturally responsive way means that we need to remember and check our stereotypes and say, oh, okay, because this student is a member of this community, this ethnic community, this national community, this age community, this sexual identity, this disability community, they're not all alike. And that we should be sort of a minimum that we have to do, of course. But I mean, I think one of the things, at least maybe I was reading something into Alita's questions, you can tell me, but one of the things that always comes up to me as an educator when I talk and think about culturally responsive practices is that there's so much nuance and gradation there that there's no way, as you said, we need to see examples, because there's no way we could really begin to be sufficiently familiar with all the cultures and subcultural nuances, especially if we have a large classroom. But does that make any sense? I'm not being my most articulate here, but and that's hard. That's hard.
So is your question about, like, what are some of the other places where you may start?
I think, yeah, I mean, how can that be part of teacher prep? And we're talking about K-12, but obviously at the university level too, but especially at K-12 because of the influence on the kids. How can you I was thinking in the back of my head actually of a colleague I know who had students. This colleague taught in Utah and had students who came from Mormon families. And that was a whole different world. Somebody might have looked at that classroom and said, oh, they all look like, white kids. Ooh, not so fast. And just things like that. How do you train teachers to support teachers to deal with all that kind of difference and things that they may have no way of being aware of because they're not part of those communities?
Mm-hmm. So I think that the first place to start clearly is teacher prep, right? So I think that it is this examination as teacher educators of what we're teaching and whom we're teaching. And so I think that teacher educators need to do a top to bottom review of really the ethno-racial identity of the people that they're teaching. So if you're teaching content methods class and all the authors are white people, then it says a lot about um, you can't expect the people you're training to go out and do this work if you aren't doing this work yourself, right? And I would suspect, and I know, right, that by dint of peoples of color, that their experience, that they will trouble the traditional content that we teach. And so I think the first place to start is for us teacher educators to do a top and bottom review of what we're teaching and ensuring that we have diverse representation on our curriculum, because we can't expect teachers to do it. And then we rename, right? We're saying, look, this is how Pam Grossman is talking about this idea. I know Pam. Pam is a mentor of mine. Pam was my teacher. Pam is a white woman. And this is how Django Paris, right? This is how they are treating and talking about these two ideas, both of whom I respect, but both come at the content in particular ways that are helpful for students, teachers to know about, and for us teacher educators to name. And I would say that same practice is what we would want our pre-service teachers to do when they become classroom teachers, for them to think about who are the books, who are the people that they're teaching, what are the experiences, the cultural experiences of the people that they're teaching. And I think that those are some of the ways that you can begin to do this work, but we have to always start with ourselves.
Alrighty, and then we are near the end of the session for tonight. Were there any last questions, comments, or concerns that anybody had?
I had just one question. I know it's the end of the session, but just very quickly. So my name is Asia Leduc. I'm also a School of Education teacher prep faculty, along with Rajiv and Alita in early childhood. I'm working with mostly elementary pre-service teachers. I guess coming back to Alita's comment about, fellow faculty and kind of maybe being dismissive, or I think from my point of view, I think it's perhaps in some ways due to the systems by which we are judged as a program, right? So our program just recently went through accreditation. And so, and there's, some inherent problems there, but the standards by which we are measured perhaps are problematic in and of themselves, right? Or not inclusive, or perhaps reward more performative forms of racial and social justice. And so I think that sometimes, in my opinion, that contributes to a sort of, well, we're doing great attitude. And yet, our program, we also have a new faculty member in our department who is getting the same, comments that you mentioned about being, the first Black teacher or faculty member to our students, which again, that's obviously indicating that we're not doing everything we can. We haven't diversified our faculty. And so I guess my question is, like, what has worked for you in your work to kind of simultaneously, deal with the systems that we have in place and helping, students of color or pre-service teachers of color gain access and be successful, while also trying to disrupt or shift those systems?
How do I both do what I'm being tasked to do, and how do I also disrupt? I mean, as I understand it, that the standards for for accreditation, or to get certified, in terms of they're not telling you what to teach. I mean, right, they're not telling you the content to teach, they're just telling you these are some of the ideas, the themes that, and so I think it's to the point that I just suggested earlier, right? I mean, it's, if you only have Pam Grossman on your syllabus and you don't have Jane Gutierrez, there is space to include both of those places, both of those, authors. And so I think it's really about looking and examining your curriculum that gets at the disruption, because and it's too easy to say that we can't do it because the standards, right? I mean, the standards just give you some, general guidance. They don't tell you what to teach. We, because of the racist ideas that we have by dint of living in a racist country, turn to the people that we know best, that we think are the smartest to teach. So I think that there is absolute freedom to do this within, to both do the disruption and to teach and to get whatever the accreditation you need. And we at UC Berkeley just went through accreditation, so I'm very familiar with the process as well.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Bristol, for being here with us today. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us as well and taking the time to be here and participate in today's Zoom session. Our facilitator has linked the survey that we have going on for our Social Justice Week in the chat. We are based on funding off of the information that we gather from Social Justice Week. So if you guys could all take some time out of your day to go ahead and do that survey, that would be super awesome. And once again, I just greatly appreciate all you guys, our student facilitator and Professor Henry, for also hosting Social Justice Week. And we will also be hosting our awards and contest winners on Friday at 7 p.m. if you guys want to go ahead and join that. And just once again, just thank you. I appreciate you guys. And if you guys want to join any more of our Zoom sessions, go ahead and check out our website at ssusocialjusticeweek.wordpress. And yeah, that'll be all for today. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle.